Thanks, Anthony. I've got a bit of a cold today, so I hope my voice holds up. Can you all hear me at the back? Yep, great. So I'm here to talk today about designing and building digital products, particularly if you're not technical yourself. It ties into a lot of the topics we heard earlier today from people who have experience with building digital startups. So a bit about my background. As Anthony said, I used to work on Google Maps. I've also got 5 years experience as a software engineer prior to starting work at Google. So I used to work on the software that's used at most of Australia's ports to make sure that ships don't run aground. It's kind of like air traffic control for ships. And I then did a PhD in computer science in between before starting at Google. So as a product manager for the Google Maps web APIs, what that meant was basically I was in charge of the product design and business strategy for the Maps APIs. For anyone who doesn't know what an API is, the Maps API is basically what lets other developers put a map on their website. So whenever you've seen a map on a real estate site or a hotel site, basically the team that I used to work on was the team that makes that possible. And a bit about Gibbs Tech. So as Anthony said, I started Gibbs Tech earlier this year. Basically, I'm not from Gippsland, but my husband is, so his family have been in the area for about 30 years now. And for me, we've always wanted to live here at some point in our lives, but we never thought that I'd be able to find a job here in my industry. So actually, after I left Google, when I was thinking about maybe starting my own company instead of finding another job, I decided instead of starting just yet another software company in Melbourne, actually I'll start a company in Gippsland and focus specifically on helping regional businesses. Because basically, as we heard from, as a theme from a lot of the startups today, digital technology is such an equalizer across geographies. You can do it from anywhere. You can do it traveling around Australia. You can start a global tech company from Wagga Wagga. Or basically, if you're starting a tech startup, which is entirely online, there's no reason that it can't be done from a small country town, just as well as from Melbourne or Sydney. One barrier to that, obviously, is that digital inclusion gap, and in particular, the skills gap. So to me, actually, I think regional businesses need digital technology even more than urban businesses do. So one of the things that I would really love to see over the next few years is for regional areas to not just catch up, but overtake urban areas on digital ability. Because it's more important for regional businesses. And I would love to see the next billion-dollar tech startup in Australia come from a small country town and stay based in that town as they grow, rather than coming from Melbourne or Sydney. So that's why I started Gibbs Tech out here in Gippsland to help regional businesses make the most of technology rather than just founding yet another Melbourne software company. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is designing and building a tech product, particularly when you're not a technical person yourself. And some of the topics that I'll cover include the number one question I get from non-technical people considering building a tech product is, how much should a website or app cost? What's the biggest mistake I've seen people make when they're building a tech product? Third, the process that Google Ventures, which is Google's startup investment fund, the process that they use with their startups to make sure that their products that they're designing and building end up being successful. And finally, what's the number one cost that people tend to forget to factor into their planning when they're thinking about building a digital product? So starting with the first one, the top question I get asked by non-technical people, how much should a website or app cost? Well, that's a bit like asking how much should a building cost without specifying which building. And the difference between buildings and websites or apps is, for a building, most of us can tell between those four buildings which one's most to least expensive. Whereas for a website, it's actually quite difficult. Like, which of these two websites would cost you more to build? The one on the left seems pretty simple. Surely it wouldn't cost that much to build. But if you really think about what the Google search page does underneath, it would cost you billions to replicate that. Google has literally been inventing new AI algorithms, like completely cutting-edge stuff, in order to make a lot of that stuff possible. They have data centers all over the world to be able to serve those queries lightning fast, no matter where you are. On the other hand, the website on the right, on the surface, it looks a bit more complicated. It's got all these pictures, it's got more content on there, but that's just a really simple WordPress blog. It's about as simple as a website can get. So with a website, it's quite hard to tell just from its appearance how complex it is. The cost of building a website is very much dependent on the behavior, the features, the interaction, the technology that's needed underneath to make all of that possible. So it's quite hard for a non-technical person to tell how much is my idea going to cost to build. So given all that, how do you actually keep costs down as a business person? How do you make your idea into reality without breaking the bank? Well, basically, the answer to that is instead of just coming up with an idea in isolation and then going to a developer and saying, build this, you need to iteratively work with your developer to understand the cost of different features, the trade-offs between different design decisions, what might be ways to simplify things and still get you most of what you need, as well as make sure you don't build things you don't need. That's a theme that we've heard throughout today. Simplicity, build the minimum viable product. Basically, work with your customers to understand what their needs are, because maybe that feature that you thought was really critical, actually your customers don't care about that at all. And maybe that feature happens to be the most expensive thing on your website. Like one example that I heard of from one of the startups that I mentored was the non-technical founder came to me and said, so I'm thinking of building this website and I've been quoted $100,000 for it. Does that seem reasonable? And I had a look at the website design and it's like, if you cut this one feature, that's half your development costs. How important is this feature to your customers? So basically understanding which features are really critical and which features can you cut to reduce costs. That can save you a lot of money if you think about that from the start. Now, understanding what your customers need and what features are critical and which ones are not, that's another thing that we heard about in a few of the other startup stories today. So obviously you've got some intuition about your business, your customers, but nothing quite substitutes for actually listening to your customers and asking them what's most important to them, hearing what their problems are. So that brings me to the number one mistake that I see people make with building digital products, which is building before actually testing a prototype. I would always, always recommend find some way to test your product idea as simply, as cheaply as possible before you invest large amounts of money in building it, especially if your product's going to take $100,000 to build. And just a story to illustrate why testing is so important. I'll tell you about one specific, quite small feature that we built on the Google Maps API. So how many of you have ever come across this problem where you're reading a website on your phone and you're scrolling along and then you come to a map and you touch the map and suddenly you've scrolled the map off into some random direction? Raise your hand if you've had that problem. It's really annoying, isn't it? At Google we heard that our users were finding this problem. It's really annoying. We've all had it before ourselves. So we decided, right, let's fix this. So the problem there is basically what you want is when you first touch the map, it might be accidental. So you wanted to scroll the page underneath instead of scrolling the map. But at the same time, the user might actually want to interact with the map. They might want to zoom, they might want to move the map around. So you want to give the user a way to turn interaction back on. You want the map to be not interactive, but give the user a way to make it interactive. So we thought, let's just make the map non-interactive to begin with, but we'll add this little lock button to the map. Make it locked to begin with, and you can click the button and unlock interactivity and make the map unlocked. Then you can interact with it. Surely that will solve the problem. Fortunately, we built a prototype, and we put it in front of some users. Like, we just built a very simple prototype in one day, put it in front of some users to test it out. And what we found was that initial solution, 80% of users didn't find the lock button. There was only one button on the map. There was nothing else they could do with it. But when we asked them to interact with the map and move it around, 80% of users thought the map was broken. They just didn't see this button. It was right there. We tested a whole bunch of different designs for solving this problem. We tried making the button bigger, we tried using different icons, we tried having a big bar at the top with big letters saying, click here to turn on interactivity, and people still missed it. In the end, what we realized was that whole idea of having to switch the map from interactive to non-interactive, users just didn't get that. And the design we finally went with completely did that approach. So what you might see now when you're looking at a web page and then you come across a map, when you first touch the map, instead of moving the map will get grayed out, and you'll get these words saying use 2 fingers to move the map. Because with 2 feet, like that's fine, there's no need to switch modes. 1 finger moves the page, 2 fingers moves the map. And when we tested that, all the users except one, so 9 out of 10 actually got it. One user was a bit confused at first and then figured it out. So that design, everyone just got it. The first design we came up with, 80% of people were confused, and if we'd launched that, it would have just been a disaster. So if something that simple, that's just one button, one little feature, can actually be that surprising in the way your users respond to it, think about how your product idea, for your app or website, whatever you're thinking of building, how many possibilities there are for things to go wrong. So that's why you really want to actually test things, because maybe that feature you think is really critically important, your users won't even notice it. So before you spend lots of money actually building the real thing, find a way to try it out in a small way. And try out lots of different designs, not just the first idea you have. So, some of those lessons, your users are going to surprise you in what they do and don't notice, what's important to them, what's not. So, test the prototype before you spend lots of money building it. But how do you actually prototype and test that without wasting time and money? Well, that's where the Google Ventures design sprint process comes in. Now, I'm just going to give you a 5-minute, very condensed version of it today, but if you're interested, there's a whole book published on this called Sprint, so you can go and look this up afterwards. Now, this is a 5-day process that Google Ventures uses with the startups they invest in to help them try out lots of different ideas in a very short time frame to make sure what they're building actually is what their users need. On day 1, the team gets together to try and understand the problem. So the goal is to get in several experts that approach the problem from different sides. So somebody who really understands the user mindset. What does the user need in this situation? What are they thinking? What problem are they trying to solve? What pain points does this cause them? What existing solutions do they use right now, and why are they not good enough? Somebody who can approach it from the marketing perspective. Someone who understands the technical side and what's actually possible to build and how much work things would take. Someone who understands the business and finance side. Get all these people together in a room and get them to all present their different points of view on the problem. To spend the entire first day just learning what's the problem we're trying to solve before you jump into solutions. Day 2 is basically the brainstorming session. So Google Ventures found that traditional brainstorming, where you have like 5, 7 people in a room all shouting out ideas at the same time, that causes problems because 1, it leads to groupthink really early. People start building on each other's ideas and their ideas become similar. And so you get less creativity. People don't think of ideas that are a bit outside the box. And secondly, the loudest people, their ideas get heard. The quietest people, they might have just as good ideas, but they're not as good as putting them forward. And so some good ideas might get missed just because the people who thought of them weren't confident enough, didn't say them loudly enough, those ideas didn't get picked up. So the approach they use for coming up with lots of creative solutions, maximizing creativity in a group of people, is they get people to think of ideas on their own first. And this is actually a technique that I end up using in my teams even for very simple, like 5-minute creativity brainstorming exercises. So instead of everyone shouting out ideas, you give each person a piece of paper, you fold the paper over, so it's cut into 8 slices, as you can see in the picture there. And then you set a timer for 8 times 1 minute, and you just come up with one idea per page, just in 1 minute each. So if you have 5 people, in 8 minutes, you've come up with 40 ideas. And each person comes up with these ideas independently. So you get more variety of ideas. People, like the quiet person in the corner whose ideas might just get overruled by the loud person in a brainstorming discussion, that person might come up with the most out there, the most creative ideas when they're thinking of those ideas on their own and they have time and space to think. So basically the idea is you get people to come up with lots of ideas on their own, then you put the ideas together, share them, discuss them, and then you start to see ideas that can be put together and combined in interesting ways. So basically, with this individual brainstorming process, you end up with more variety, and then by merging them together, you come up with the best ideas. You can select the best ideas out of those. Day 3 is you choose your solution, because out of those 40 ideas, you're not going to be able to test all of them, but you can test a few combinations, like put a few pieces together, and pick one thing that you're going to prototype on the next day. On day 3, you flesh out the full details of your design. So that's where you might pick pieces of solutions that different people came up with. One thing that you'll find when people come up with lots of different ideas is you'll have some ideas that are contradictory, that you can't build both at once. Like with that map example, we couldn't have both a button that switched interactivity on and off and some kind of one finger, two finger, non-modal design. So that was a choice. You could use one or the other. And likewise, in whatever app or website you're thinking of building, when you come up with a bunch of designs, you'll find that there's some designs where you can't have both sides. You have a choice. And there's other designs where you might be able to combine elements of both designs. So day 3, you pick the solutions you want to try out, flesh out the details, and then on day 4, you prototype. Build something that's real enough to actually put in front of users and have them play with. And I'll have some resources on how to do that in a day later. And then day 5, you actually put it in front of 5 real users. I had to have one cute cat photo somewhere in this presentation. I really love cats. So the reason why 5 real users is, in user testing research, what they found is 5 is about the number where you'll find 80% of problems. Because basically, if you have problems that are really big and obvious, like in our example, 80% of users didn't find the button, 5 users, you'll notice those problems. And if you test with 10 or 50 users, they'll mostly tell you about those same really obvious problems. Likewise, if your app mostly works, then within 5 users, you'll realize it mostly works. And so 5 users basically is the magic number to test with initially. Now, some tools for rapid prototyping. Paper is kind of the one that you'd naturally start with as you're sketching out your designs. But the problem with paper is users can't click on paper. So when you put paper in front of a user, instead of reacting to it the way that they would to an actual app or website, they give you their thoughts rather than their reactions of I'd click here, I'd click there. So paper actually tends to give lower quality feedback, what they've found in running lots of these design sprints. So what they actually recommend is, even if it's just a PowerPoint presentation, give users something that looks real enough that they can try clicking on it at least. So PowerPoint is one of the simplest tools to make a prototype with. Obviously, you don't need to be able to code to make a PowerPoint presentation. And PowerPoint, because you can flip between slides, it's just enough to be able to show the user, here's what it would look like if you click this button. Here's what it would look like if you expanded this section. So you can see how a user would respond without having an actual working app or website built. There's various interactive prototyping tools out there that let you basically create pictures with clickable areas on them and link those together. So it looks like an app that works, even though really it's just a bunch of pictures. Then another option is make a fake website or app, so something that is super simple but looks like it works. Like if you were trying to prototype Google search, you could make something that looks like it works, but in reality, the only thing it does is bring you a list of cute cat videos. And then in your test, you just say to your participant, now I'd like you to search for cute cat videos. And funnily enough, cute cat videos come up, so it looks like it works, even though it's completely fake in the background. Sometimes you might be able to find some existing software that does kind of what you want. Like, for example, SurveyMonkey for surveys, There might be some app or website out there that's kind of similar and that you can put in front of a user and get them to try it out. And also, one thing, because you're only testing with 5 users, one possibility is having a manual process in the background. Like, for example, get somebody to fill out a survey, and then you manually have somebody in an office send an email. Because it's only 5 people, you can have a manual process. It doesn't matter if it's not realistic for the real product. And some ideas for user testing approaches. There's basically 2 options when you're doing user testing. You can either ask people you know, or you can use some kind of service to get user testers online, like usertesting.com. The pros and cons of those: asking people you know, obviously you can change your questions on the fly. So if somebody gets stuck somewhere, if they don't understand, you can adjust your questions, you can help them out and give hints. The downside of asking people you know is sometimes they might be, like if they're a friend, they might be a bit reluctant to give you negative feedback and to tell you that this design idea really sucks. Whereas some random person on usertesting.com who doesn't know you and who's just reading instructions off a script, they're more likely to tell you if they can't figure it out or if they just hate it. Also, asking people you know, there's a risk of bias there. For instance, at Google, asking people we know would mean asking the software engineer sitting in the team next to us. And when we tested that design with the lock button with them, being kind of at the top 1% of tech-savvy people, most of them noticed that there was this button on the map that you could press, and so most of them tried pressing the button. So the software engineers didn't have any problems with finding the button. When we actually took it out into the real world with real users, they didn't notice the button. So the bias of who you test with and who the people you know are might bias your results. With usertesting.com, the downside, and similar services, the downside of that is, like, one, there's a cost to it. On the other hand, it does save you time because basically once you've written up a script, you don't have to sit there with a user asking them questions. The user just follows the script and you get a recording of the video afterwards. Also, you can really target the types of users you want, so you can choose people based on their familiarity with technology, you can choose people based on their profession, based on where they live, based on age, etc., etc. So if you're after a particular target market, you can find users specifically in that target market to give feedback on your product. So just a summary of keeping software development costs low. As we heard from several of the speakers today, only build what you really need. Make sure you test before you build so that you know that you actually do need it, and so you don't waste time building something that your users might not even find. And as a process for testing, the design sprint process is a way to come up with an idea, prototype it, test it, and get feedback in just 5 days. And one unexpected cost that a lot of people do forget, and we heard about that from Marco as well today, maintenance and technical debt. So this is a really, really common issue, especially, and I've seen this a lot, especially with people who end up hiring outsourced software developers, that they get somebody to build their app or website, and then 2 years later they want to add a new feature, and they discover that the backend has no documentation, no tests, or the only documentation is in Chinese, or there's all sorts of shortcuts that have been taken which now have to be paid for. So while it may seem quicker and easier to go with the cheapest provider, the person who says they can do it fastest, in the long run, that is going to cost you. And often it's going to cost you at the worst possible moment, like for instance, when your site goes down because it's been hacked, or when you have a large new client and suddenly who's asking for new features, and suddenly you need to build something on short notice, and you discover that the backend is unmaintainable, or or your software developer quits and you hire somebody new to discover the documentation is in Chinese and the new person doesn't read Chinese. So to avoid all of these sorts of issues, one really difficult question that non-technical startup founders face is, how do you evaluate the quality of a software developer? If you're not technical yourself, you can't do technical interviews, it's very hard to tell, basically, does the software developer know what they're talking about? Are they actually building something good quality? How do I know that? So there's two types of evaluation that you'd want to do as a non-technical startup founder. One is kind of the visible software quality. So does it actually do what I want it to do? Does it look good from the outside? That's the easy part to evaluate. So you can get them to build something small first, see basically, is it good quality as a user? The harder part is kind of the quality of the underlying foundations. So this is the thing that's really hard to tell without asking an independent expert to evaluate. So if you are spending $100,000 on building some renovations to your house, or if you were spending several $100,000 buying a house, you'd normally get a building report beforehand just to make sure that the construction is sound, that they didn't take shortcuts with the materials, that there's no asbestos in the place, for instance. If you're spending large amounts of money building software, I would actually recommend also hiring an independent expert to evaluate the software developer, because otherwise you risk a similar kind of situation that you spend large amounts of money and then it's like you've moved into a house only to discover that the roof leaks and that after a year there's cracks appearing in the walls and that it turns out the basement floods every few months. So to save yourself those kinds of unpleasant surprises, especially if you're investing 6 figures or more in a software product, it is really worthwhile getting that evaluated independently as well, especially if you're not developing it in-house and if you're going to a contractor. So here's just a summary of everything I've talked about today. So if you want to take a photo of a slide for your notes, this is the one to take a photo of. App and website costs can vary as dramatically as the cost of a house, everything ranging from a tin shed to a skyscraper. There's websites and apps out there that have the same kind of price range. So don't build any unnecessary features. Make sure that you actually test the prototype before you spend lots of money on it. Use the design sprint process, and don't forget your maintenance. Thank you. Any questions?
That was awesome. I think I'm the loud guy in the room. Anybody got any questions?
I just wanted to say it was awesome.
Thank you.
I'm yours.
Me too. Anyone who's not sure about API, it's an application program interface. I love the 2-finger option on mobile. It's good. Sorry, was there a question?
Oh, no, that's all right.
No, it's all right.
The sprint process.
Yep.
Can you see that being applied online, or does it need to be done physically in between people?
It can be done online. Actually, in the book they do have some examples of how to use it online, I think. And Google Ventures also has a blog where they publish extra materials around that process. Yep.
Cost associated to all of that?
The sprint process? No, like they published it in the book. The process is free. You can read the book and basically run it in any organization with any kind of new product or service. Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
I understand you have a digital agency that builds websites.
Yeah. So Gibbs Tech, basically, there's 2 types of work we do. Part of it is around community building and education. So things like being involved in organising this conference. We've started a tech meetup in Gippsland that basically, if you search for Gippsland Tech and Business Meetup, we set that up a few months ago. We worked with Girl Geek Academy to run a SheHacks training bootcamp earlier this year. So we do all of that kind of community and education work, but we also have a digital agency. So we do things like website development or consulting on software development. Yeah.
And as part of the process in the digital agency, you have design sprint, and if you have a design sprint that lasts for 5 days?
It depends on the scope of the project. So if somebody, like, for instance, has $2,000 to build a very simple website, that's not going to be enough for like a 5-day design sprint and then the actual building of the website afterwards. Yeah, or we'd condense it down to just, say, speaking with the client about starting with what are the goals. So one thing that we actually really try not to do is just, just take a design and build that. Like, we try to actually think about what are the underlying goals of the business? How does the design support that business? Are there ways to improve the design to either cut costs or basically is there something that like a business need that could be improved by changing the design? So in that case, it wouldn't be the full 5-day sprint process, but it would be at least some elements of that.
And for bigger projects, you do,
Yeah, yeah.
but they need to be pretty big.
They'd need to be big enough for it to be worthwhile, basically. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Quick question about the 1 day, so the fourth day,
Uh-huh.
I guess is doing the prototype.
Yep.
So that would be appropriate for sort of medium or low complexity projects.
Mhm.
If you have like a very complex project and a large industrial solution, obviously 1 day is not enough to do a prototype.
Yeah, so actually, it depends to some extent on the type of project. Like in the sprint book, they had one example where a company was prototyping a robot that delivers room service in hotels. And in that case, they had a partial robot built, but they were testing some new ideas around the design of the robot. So they were able to add, like obviously they have an existing company, they had an existing team of engineers, but they were able to test some of the features that they were wanting to try out to the robot in a day, in a kind of like obviously half-assed way with bugs, etc. But it was good enough to test out with 5 real hotel customers. So it would depend obviously on the type of project. They also have some examples of ways to prototype, even for projects where it's not feasible. Like, for instance, if you really can't make a real working prototype, you could produce and explain a video, like a video of it in action, or there's a few other examples in the book. That another example is if you're prototyping, for instance, a physical space, like a retail store, maybe take an existing physical space and make a few tweaks to it to make it close enough to what you're aiming for. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Any questions? Fascinating,
Mm-hmm.
fascinating. Thank you. And
Yeah.
I really admire what we're doing to bring other people in by holding seminars for people around the area. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Really nice.
Oh.